Welcome back. I'm very glad to say we're here today with Carmen Nobel, who is the program director and editor-in-chief of the Journalist Resource, which she joined in 2018 after serving as senior editor of Harvard Business School Working Knowledge. The Journalist Resource was created in 2010 to help journalism professors teach policy coverage by creating a central database of research summaries. In the years since, the Journalist Resource has expanded its role, aiming to support newsrooms that lack research desks. JR, as they call it, serves tens of thousands of educators, journalists, and others across the planet, providing a vital bridge between the worlds of research and journalism. The site now offers nearly 2,800 articles, research roundups, tip sheets, webinar recordings, and comics relevant to newsworthy topics such as income inequality, gun violence, and inequities in healthcare. In other words, you guys curate the flow of academic research on topics that are often in the news to help reporters help readers.
That's right.
And let's start with defining what need the people who created the Journalist Resource had in mind. I mean, my sense from talking to the folks in the early days was that they saw a gap between the amazing wealth of information out there in academic articles and the ability of journalists to find them, understand them, and make them digestible for readers.
Yes. And the Journalist Resource was largely the brainchild of Professor Thomas Patterson at Harvard Kennedy School. He's a media scholar and public policy scholar. And he noticed the need for what he termed knowledge-based reporting and knowledge-based journalism. And basically, he was noticing that largely journalists did not seem to be, based on their reporting and what he was hearing from journalism schools, arming themselves with academic research knowledge before they went out to cover any given topic. They were taught to pick up the phone, hit the streets, find sources, but didn't necessarily have a good grounding in whatever topic they were covering. And in the meantime, there were academic researchers all over the world studying very particular sectors of any given topic. But they were not trained, and it's not their job, and didn't necessarily think to share their knowledge with the journalists who were covering these topics. Because their goal was to get published in very particular academic journals that are read by other academics. So the broad goal was to bridge a necessarily communication gap in the interest of informing the news. And that's how the project got started.
So we can think of knowledge-based journalism as research-based journalism, because this is all about how we use research to get the knowledge to help our readers. So you mentioned sort of institutional siloing, and was there sort of cultural differences that what do you see as the reasons for these kind of gaps or barriers?
I think one is the language of academic language in general. Here, can I back that up? I'm sorry. That's
okay.
I'm sorry. Do you want to ask the question again? Or
yeah. I'm just trying to remember how I asked it.
What are the reasons for the gap between academia and journalism?
3, 2, 1. So knowledge-based journalism, to Tom's term, we can, in this course, think of as research-based journalism, because the knowledge comes from research. And all this research that's being done that sits over here and doesn't make it over to there. As you've worked with academics and journalists, what's your sense of the reason for this gap?
There are a few reasons. One practical reason is that a lot of good academic research that's published in high-quality peer-reviewed journals sits behind paywalls. So journalists who do try to find this research find that, oh, I'm paywalled, and they stop there. Two, when they do read these research papers, they see that, one, these papers are very long, hundreds of pages long, and they're on deadline. They don't have time to pour through an academic research article, let alone many, many academic research articles. And the language of these articles is written in very, very often seemingly inscrutable language. That's academic language that isn't necessarily easily understood by journalists or anyone else who's not an academic.
They have a different idea of what the lead should be like.
And exactly, yeah. Yeah, and then we can get into that. But one common mistake journalists make is to assume if you open any given academic article, you'll see the abstract on the top, and they assume that's a summary of the high points of the paper. But what an academic thinks is the most important information to include in the beginning of the intro of their paper is not necessarily what a journalist would find interesting or what the general public would find interesting.
Do you think that this is a bigger problem in certain sectors and certain subject matters than others?
The more I do this job, the more I think it's pretty much across the board. Some social science papers are written in more accessible language. Some academic journals that have bigger budgets, I think, are taking the time. And I'm seeing this more and more, which is great. Like the Journal of the American Medical Association makes a point of highlighting the key points of this article in non-academic terms to make it more accessible to other people. But generally, and I think economic research is especially hard to understand for journalists who don't have a good understanding of economic research.
So walk us through how the journalist resource bridges that gap, both in terms of what you look for to decide on what studies you're going to pull out, and then how you curate them to make them more useful for working journalists?
Yeah, sure. We're a very small team. We're a team of 4, all seasoned journalists who joined. And we're based at Harvard University. And we joined the team because we had a love of research and a realization that there was a need for a resource like this. So we have a news meeting every week to talk about what are the topics in the news that could be better informed with research. And then the team goes to it. Usually we have several different types of content, but our bread and butter are these research roundups where our team will go through the body of research on the topic of the day. So something about gun violence or school shootings, or this week we have one on dengue fever because that's on the rise in the US. And we'll curate 5 to 10 good studies on that topic, using various metrics for what we think makes up a good study. And then we'll summarize those studies in like 100 to 200 words.
So how many studies would somebody normally look at to pick out 5?
I mean, they can go through hundreds. I think that because we're time constrained too, what we try to do is look at what are called systematic reviews or meta-analyses on topics. And these are studies these are basically studies of studies, where an academic researcher has gone through hundreds of studies on a topic and kind of sussed out what they think are the most high quality research on that topic, and then highlight those studies saying like, these are the ones to look at. Here's what these studies are finding. Here are the different types of, and I can go through the rabbit hole. But I would say probably they'll quickly pour through maybe 100 before they get to 10.
Well, you guys also build up a sort of archive. I mean, presume there's an archive in the summaries you have on your website, and then there's probably an archive in each of your head of all the studies you've looked at besides the ones that are. So when a new topic arises, how do you draw on the work that you've already done?
You've done already? No, that's a great question. And ideally, it's hard to know what's going to happen in the news. But as you said, the news cycle is cyclical, and any given topic, it's going to come up again in the news. So when news breaks, we look to see how have we covered this in the past and what's missing since then. So we will update our research roundups with more recent research or new findings.
And that would be something people could find in your newsletter. You're going to give here's the latest, because sort of tracking the news, that's probably your tool that's most closely tied to what's in the news on a given day or the day before, I would guess.
Yeah, so I guess two things, and we can get into this more if you want to, but we have our primary dissemination vehicle is journalistresource.org, which is an open access website available to anybody who wants to see it and can find it. And everything we publish on that website is available under a Creative Commons license, which means anybody is free to take it and republish it elsewhere. But to your point, the main way people find out about what's new on our website is our weekly email newsletter that goes out to about 42,000 people, thousands of journalists. And then we will tell them, yes, we have a new research roundup, we have a new tip sheet on this particular aspect of research, or we will tell them, yeah, we've updated a research roundup on this topic. Because
so some reporters might just read your summary and say, here's a fact I can use, or say, here's some context I can put in. But I think in a lot of cases, it's going to be, the next step will be to call the researcher or call a researcher and just like, what sense do you get of like, this isn't always the ideal communication pairing. So what should reporters know about what academics do and don't do well in communicating? And there are things that reporters can do better to understand, talk the academics' language to make the conversation go well.
Okay. I will start with the biggest frustration for reporters is that academics' idea of a deadline is not the same as the reporter's idea of a deadline. So when a reporter says, can you please get back to me as soon as possible, for an academic, that might mean I have a month to get back to the person. So I think what reporters can do better is explain, I really want to talk to you, but my copy is due in 4 hours and I need you back to me.
I always found putting in the subject line, daily deadline, or if it's not, to make it clear in there, I'm not filing today, but I need to speak to you tomorrow or by the end of the week.
And I think often, and this is I think it's the reporter's job to eke out the information that they really need for this story. And academics are very excited about what they're talking about, but they can go on and on and on the way they do in their papers. So I think one technique that's pretty easy is just saying, please explain this to me the way you would to your mom or to your little brother or to a sixth grader. And that I've found that really works, and that academics, because they have explained their work to other people in the past.
I always go with uncle because I don't want to be stereotypical about moms. So. Or your brother-in-law who thinks he knows everything but doesn't. So, and when they're talking, I know it's a frustration some academics have expressed to me. They've sort of said, I have spent X number of years on this subject and no one has ever expressed any interest in it. And now everyone's calling me and I know they're going to use one sentence. So what's something reporters can do you're on a deadline, that's one thing. But sometimes we approach interviews thinking, I've got a jigsaw puzzle, I need this piece. But ideally, you're going into a conversation with an academic, so someone who's very knowledgeable. How do you open up? You mentioned just to explain it to me, but how do you do a conversation in a way that goes beyond your third paragraph need to sort of maybe I need to rethink how I present this subject in general? How do you learn from an academic beyond just a plug and play sort of hit and run interview?
And that's a great point, and that's a big thing that we want to do at the Journalist Resource, that this isn't about finding a quote. This is about informing your work in the interest of informing the public. And I think journalists can kind of set the scene with whoever they're interviewing with from the get-go to explain that, and to set some guidelines and expectations, and explaining, I so value the time you're giving me, but just know that I have maybe 200 words for this story. So don't be alarmed or upset if, your quote even gets cut by my editor, or you just have like 3 lines, because you can see when you read the story that the knowledge you're sharing with me has informed this story. You're not cited as the source of that story. And academics can go back and forth to say, it's very unlikely. I've never had this happen, but if they are free to say, that's not worth my time, they maybe would like to talk to this other person. And I think the other thing, the frustration we hear is that journalists didn't get it quite right. And if they're burned and that happens, not necessarily misquoted, but they feel like the information they shared wasn't presented correctly, then they don't want to talk to another reporter. The reporter can make it clear up front, like, look at it, I'm going to repeat back to you what you just told me. If it doesn't sound like I quite understood it, please let me know.
One of the first lessons I learned, and probably a lot of people, it's sort of a cliche, that there's no such thing as a dumb question, but to go into this, you have to be willing to make clear, I don't know this stuff, you do, that's why we're here, and if you don't understand it, to be willing to say, I don't understand it, or can we approach this a different way? There's also the question of like, when is the right time to either go to your website or go to these people, because we've talked so far sort of in the context of you're writing a story, but my colleague Barbara Gray, who's the co-teacher here, has talked with the class about developing beat resources, and there's what's the advantage of going to either the literature or the experts themselves before there's a story, just to sort of general education on a subject? How does that work differently?
Yeah, I think, and we encourage journalists to turn to research at every step of the reporting process, from generating a story idea to fact checking your own story before it goes to print, or not necessarily print, but also broadcast. I need to make sure I include those people in the conversation. But I would say the first story generation idea, as you arm yourself with the knowledge, that you're eventually going to want to look at that topic. Getting on journalists and on academic research can really help. One thing that I think journalists and academics don't always realize is that their process they both use, that they're both kind of investigators. So the more journalists read academic research, the more they're likely to realize, this researcher is actually conducting an investigation that people might want to know about. And they can almost sometimes form partnerships with researchers and investigate a story together. So it's not just breaking news, it's coming up with ideas for deep dive investigations.
And I think that the journalists might tend to look at a study. I think academics see that it's a process in which many studies are done, and that no one study is the answer on. Is that something that you see as, you guide people not to a single, your roundups obviously are not about a single study, but how do you give a reporter the sense of like the scope of the field or the trend in the field?
Yes, and I think that message is, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's a peeve of academics, that they often call the single study problem of journalism, that journalists who don't necessarily understand how research works will assume that the latest study that came out is the last word. And then the next study that comes out on that topic is the new last word. And I think the best way to describe it is that academic studies are meant to be kind of an input to a larger body of research, to inform that larger body of research on any given topic. And more often than not, there is not yet a scientific consensus on that topic. So we and academics encourage journalists not to consider research an output as much as an input. So if they're going to cover a brand new study, make it clear that this study is part of a larger body of research. And that can help. That can also help them vet, is it worth covering this topic? Because if a new study comes out that says the exact opposite of what 100 other studies have found in the large body of research, then they can ask questions, why is that? Is it really worth covering this? Or at least ask the researcher, please explain. Conclusions.
I know that surveys have found that readers don't like the sense that caffeine is good for you, it's bad for you, it's good for you, just that, as opposed to there's a lot that's being studied on this and we're working it out.
I was going to say that it's always coffee, chocolate, and red wine. You're right. And then looking at a larger body of research on any of that can help explain that. Another thing is to make sure that you're looking at the sample that was studied. So were you the study on, 5 women?
Sample size, you mean?
Sample size, but also the geographic sample. I'm sorry. So if you're looking at, and I should probably back up. So can we edit this part out? Because I'm babbling.
Okay. Trying to remember, what should we go back to?
I think you're to make the point that when you're considering a study, you have to look at who was included in that study. And
okay, I'll go back to, so 3, 2, 1. So we're talking about sample size and taking a look at the characteristics of the methodology of the study.
Yes. So for any given study, especially for medical studies, but also for surveys, journalists, before they decide to cover a study, should look at how many people were included in this study and who were these people included in this study. And this is especially important for local journalists who may find the findings of a study very interesting, but if they are, like, let's say they're reporting for a particular audience in Boise, Idaho, but this study happened to be on, young teenagers in Malaysia. Maybe the findings of that study aren't applicable to this study. So it's worth asking. That's a very easy question that journalists can ask a researcher. Are these findings applicable to my audience?
Yeah, Barbara talks about, with data, interrogating the data, and I guess it's you're going to interrogate the study, and then if you get the researcher on the phone, you can interrogate the researcher. And that's part of, one thing that when I look at the journalist resource site, I know there's not going to be any junk science in there. There's not going to be junk research. So, but if people are doing, you've got an amazing collection of summaries, but it's limited. So if someone is just heading into the forest on their own, what are some tips about making sure what you're looking at is high quality and how to find the more important studies? You've mentioned meta studies as sort of being a flag that dig here and you can find, it'd be like guides to a meta study leads you to other studies, or so. But for someone setting off on their own academic research, what are some useful tips?
So tips for finding high quality research. So I will give another plug to the Journalist Resource website, because we have an entire section on our website called Know Your Research. The Know Your Research button, and if you click that, you will find tip sheets and explainers that talk about these things to explain what is peer review and why is it important for you to seek out peer-reviewed research rather than just a white paper that somebody slapped on a website and called it a study. So that's one thing. And peer review isn't a guarantee of quality, but that's a good place to start to see, has this paper been published in a peer-reviewed journal. Digging in deeper, if you're looking just for research on the topic and aren't setting out to cover any given particular study, call some researchers at universities and get their opinion. And they're generally happy if they understand this isn't an interview. I'm trying to inform myself in the interest of making better journalism. They're pretty generous. And they will say, this is what we consider the seminal study on this topic, and look at this body of research and maybe don't go this way. And just get some advice, and I realize journalists are pretty time constrained. They may not have a lot of time to do that, but making friends in the academic community who can help guide you through research is always very helpful. Google Scholar, if you're just looking for, this is kind of an easy pro tip. You don't just go to Google and Google academic studies on this topic. You go to, I think it's scholar.google.com. But if you Google Scholar, you'll have a whole different search engine that only looks at academic research. And that's a good way of finding things. And you can vet by year, and there are lots of different parameters in Google Scholar that help you narrow that search.
So in your list of tips on the website, there are also probably some that you thought about writing down in capital letters, saying, don't do this. What are the things that make you want to scream when you see them in a newspaper or on a website?
Yeah, and I think academics often hear this from them too. The biggest peeves are the headlines. And one thing I explain to scholars often is that the person who reported and wrote the story is not necessarily the person who wrote the headline, so don't get mad at them. But I think one big thing is confusing correlation with causation. And that comes down to just don't use the word prove in a headline, because unless it was a study about math, this thing probably doesn't prove this thing. One example we often use is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to go give the example because I was going to ask for a 30-second, example or summary of correlation and causation.
Okay, so say shark attacks go up in August and also ice cream consumption goes up in August. That doesn't mean that eating ice cream is going to increase your likelihood of getting attacked by a shark.
That's a good one.
And then, yeah, the examples in headlines are usually not that stark and obvious, but they alarm people. And it's often based on what you were talking about. It ties into the idea of reporting the results of a single study as if it's the last word. So then new study proves that coffee is good for you. And then the next day, new study proves that coffee is bad for you. And that's.
Well, there is some tension between, I think, some academics want nothing proves anything, and some journalists wanted here we go, all in one shot. So
yeah, and it's hard to explain that to editors that you need to use, very specific language and qualify everything, because there's not always room to do that in the story. So yeah, it's a dance.
So I want to finish by just raising something that we probably could do an entire course about, but just sort of looking in the future, because AI has arrived and it's being used in academics, it's being used by students, it's being used by journalists, and one of the key uses people talk about is AI to summarize, which is what you guys are doing. So are you experimenting at all with it? Do you have some feelings about what you think it's going to be helpful with in the near term, what the dangers are about using it?
Yeah, and we're pretty new to it and we're still figuring it out. So I don't want to say anything definitive. My take is so far is it can be helpful in grounding reporters who again don't have time to pour through all these studies. And I've tried it a few times where I'd say, please summarize this study for me. And then check the summary with a researcher. And there are so far always mistakes or it's not quite right, but it's better than nothing. It definitely, I think it can be a very useful tool to help journalists come up with questions to ask the researchers. But I think it's way too early to publish those summaries because of inevitable mistakes.
That's a very interesting approach. That's sort of turning on its head what people are saying, you won't have to write this because I can write it for you. But if instead you think of it as a research tool that helps you read the study, what do you see as the gaps? What would you want to know more about? That's interesting. So we'll all find out about this together, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased. I'm terrified of AI as a journalist. I don't want to replace our jobs, and I no, nor do I think it should. But I think, yeah, as you said, using it as a research tool, I think is
do the academics you talk to say anything about how they're using it, or
only the ones who study it. So there are a lot of academics who study the use of AI in policy and policy making. So they're playing with it. But maybe that's a question that we need to start asking more.
Okay, well,
yeah, I think we would definitely have talked to academics who study the problems with AI, but I think in the next year or two, we'll be looking at the promises of AI. So stay tuned.
well, we'll look for your research roundup on that. So thank you very much for your time. Do you want to tell people where they can go to sign up for the newsletter?
Sure. Just go to journalistsresource.org. Make sure you have the S, no apostrophe in the URL, and there's a subscribe button right on the website. We're also on X, formerly Twitter, so you can find us there. And we have a Facebook and Instagram account, but the newsletter is the easiest way. It's free, and it's the best way to find out what's new on our website.
And we'll be putting some material in the readings for this week. So, well, listen, this has been great. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be reading more on your website soon.
Yeah, thank you, and please everybody sign up for the newsletter, and thank you so much for your time.